program tonight. So just so you know that is going on. And we're trying to do backups here. So Tom's doing one way and I'm doing the other way and see what we end up with. So yes. With that, we're going to get started. I am Richard Beckort. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator in the Jackson County Purdue Extension Office. Tom Springston in Scott County is my wingman, and he will be monitoring the chat box as we go along. If I completely confuse you or have a question, you can put it in chat box, or after each section, I'll take a little stop and see if anybody has any questions as we go along. So if I
was just going to ask that question, Richard, if you'd probably prefer them to wait and ask a question when you get to a stopping point, and you'll just
they can type it in the chat box at any time, just so they don't forget their question. And then after each section, I'll take a little time. If you have some questions you want to add at that point, we can take them at that point. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Working on it here. Okay, can you all see that now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And you can see the full screen, not the two slides together.
Correct.
Okay, excellent. Okay. As you all, hopefully you know, you signed up for some tree care basics is what we're talking about tonight. And, you know, we're going to cover some selection, planting, and caring for trees, and ending up with some pruning topics. So again, if you have any questions as we go along, you can feel free to, you know, ask those in the chat box as we go along. But one of the big things I see with trees is we kind of just find a tree we think we like, or a shrub, and we put it in a place in our yard. You know, we need to really stop and take a step back before we purchase that tree and really make sure that it is fitting in the place that we want to put it in. You'll find out that trees and shrubs do a lot better if they're put in the right place in your landscape. So think about things, look through that landscape of your yard or your landscape where you're putting these plants. Think about, what's the soil moisture? What's the lay of the land? You know, what's the drainage in that area? Is there water that stands there after a rain for a day or two? Is it a high knoll that dries out pretty quick? You know, what's the shade area? How much sunshine does it get a day? Things of that nature, we need to really stop and think about what's the requirements of the plants that we're putting in this area. So when you go out to the nursery or the garden center and you start looking for plants, make sure that you just have a list with you, or a list in your mind of what the requirements of that area might be, and making sure that the plant that you select matches those requirements. You know, we all have gone out and we've just find a plant that we like. We've never seen it before, so we buy it and bring it home, and then we go, where do we put this in the landscape? But making sure that we have a place in that landscape for every plant is what we need to do. When you're out looking for plants, I have a list there on the screen of things that you need to look for. Make sure that plant's healthy, that it's been well cared for. You know, you can tell by the way the leaves look. Is there leaf scorch where that plant may or may not have been watered properly on the sales lot? It might be dried out, it might be drying out, the leaves are scorching a little bit. Make sure that it's healthy. Flip the leaves over, investigate that plant. You don't want to bring any more disease or insect problems home to your landscape, before, that you already have. You have enough problems already, thinking about where we don't want to bring any more troubles home. The other thing is take a good look at that plant before you buy it. If it's a tree, what's the limb structure? How are they, is it good structure? Does it have a split crown? Does it have two main leaders that's going to cause problems with weak crotch angles? We want to look at branch angles that are as close to 90 degrees, close to square as what we can find. That's what we want to look for when we're buying that plant. Again, we want a good, healthy plant, good shape that we bring home so we can get that plant established well to start with. A little bit about soil moisture. Know what that plant likes. Is this a wet area or a fairly dry area? Wet conditions, you're looking at things like bald cypress, willows, river birches, some of those that are naturally the things that we see growing in the wild areas. Those are the things that we need to look for, making sure that they match. If it's a drier area, some of the hardwoods, the oaks, hickories, as a general rule, pines don't like to have wet feet, things of that nature. Is there something that you can do in this area that that you might be able to amend or change in this landscape? Are the downspouts just dropping off right at the foundation base? Can we cause those, put an extension on that and get that water away from the foundation? Because a lot of our shrubs that we use a lot around foundation plantings don't like to have wet feet, especially things like taxus, the yews, do not tolerate wet feet at all. Also, the other thing to think about is, you're buying this plant, it might be in a gallon or 5-gallon container. It might have a balled and burlap root ball that's 18 inches across. But what are you going to do with this? How big is this plant going to get? What's a mature size? Is it going to be growing into other plants, other trees, the house? Think about this. On the screen there is a picture of some, hardwoods, maples, I think, that were planted underneath power lines. Those should never be there. The other thing to consider is what's the growth rate of that plant? Some of these growth rates, a fast-growing tree could put on 2+ feet a year easily. So it could get up to mature size fairly quick. Something else like an oak, it might be lucky to put on 1 foot a year. So, how soon is it going to be, that size will be a, problem, things of that nature. So just do your homework, do your investigation on the plants that you are thinking about, and do they really fit in that place? Okay, starting off with some planting guidelines, what to do, how to plant the tree or shrub when you get it home, or when you should do this. Best time to plant, I'm an advocate for spring or fall, either one. Both of them do quite well. Sometimes I prefer the fall, because that gives that tree or shrub all fall. Those roots continue to grow even if it goes dormant during the winter. Those roots continue to grow out into the existing soil. They grow again in the spring, and they have almost 3 seasons worth of growth before they hit that hot, dry period in the summer, because that is the time period that is the real stress on a newly planted tree or shrub, is that hot, dry summer weather. I don't advise anybody to plant anything this time period, that summer, July, August. No matter how much you water it, You know, here lately we've been having 90+ degree temperatures. That is just a stress and hard on those plants, especially if they don't have roots established. I've seen some plants that I've been sent pictures about or seen physically this year. They were doing well, and then about a month ago, they just dried up to nothing. The leaves dried up, turned brown. And I think what happened is there just wasn't enough root mass there established to take up as much water that those leaves were losing through transpiration through the leaves. So, you know, keep that in mind, spring or fall, either time. Another rule is don't plant when the ground is frozen. You know, not only do the plants not do well, it's just, you know, kind of lazy. I don't like to dig that hard. So, you know, wait till the ground thaws in the spring before you plant. You see on the diagram there, there's showing a proper way to plant, just talking about some things on there. We want that root ball to be setting on undisturbed soil in the bottom of the hole. So don't dig your hole real deep and then fill it back in and set the root ball on it. We want to, you know, have that root ball setting on undisturbed soil, because if you go in there and dig it all up, you put the root ball in, the first time it rains real heavy, that root ball starts sinking. We want to make sure that root ball, that tree or that shrub is planted at the same level that they were planted growing naturally, whether it was out in the nursery field or in a container. So we want to make sure we're getting that planted at exactly the same level it was planted. And so undisturbed soil, only dig that deep hole as deep as the root ball is. You can dig it as wide. We recommend a nice wide hole. You know, we want a little bit of mulch, 3 inches of mulch out in the root zone, but no mulch up on the stem of that plant. The tree, the drawing has one thing wrong with it. You know, the spikes, the tree stakes that are using to hold the tree up need to make sure that they go deeper down into undisturbed soil. So on the picture there, the stakes are just a little short. They need to be down into that subsoil, that undisturbed soil on each side of that tree. Speaking of tree stakes, not every tree needs to be staked newly. My theory is if it's not above 1 inch in diameter, it probably doesn't need to be staked. You're staking to keep the root ball from rocking in the soil. You're not staking to keep the tree top from swaying in the wind. You want that root ball to be steady, so as those new roots grow out into the soil, they're not cut off as that root ball rocks back and forth. So smaller trees, smaller shrubs probably do not need to be staked. Yeah. Larger trees, larger than 1 inch, 1.5 inches in diameter, need to be staked for a while, not forever and ever. So about 6 months for every inch of diameter. So even if it's a large tree, a year growth is probably about all that it needs to be staked. When you're planting this, again, I mentioned before, we want to plant trees at the same level they were growing before. So if you look at a tree in nature, it's not a telephone pole that just goes down into the ground. It has that root flare down at the base where that trunk gets wider and broader as it goes into the soil. So making sure you look for that root flare, get it level at the right level that it was growing before. A lot of times you can see a coloration change in that trunk where the soil was up against that trunk before, especially with bare root plants. It's real easy to see where that soil line was. But making sure that we are getting that tree planted at the correct level. If you're gonna err, it's best to plant the tree a little bit high. They'll do better than if they are planted too deep. I've just seen over the years a lot of problems with trees and shrubs that were planted too deep. So make sure you get it at the right level. The other thing about planting that we need to be thinking about is whatever soil you take out, that native soil that you take out of the planting hole, is what the soil needs to go back into that hole. What I'm trying to say is we don't want to put a lot of amendments, a lot of peat moss, compost, things of that nature around that root ball. So, you know, if it's clay that's coming out, it needs to be that clay goes back in. You might have some volume left over that you need to remove and cart off somewhere, but the same type of soil needs to go back in the hole. You might be asking, why do you do this? Well, if you look at the picture there, you know, if it's especially if it's a heavy clay soil, if you come in and put a lot of amendments in that soil, that backfill, if you add a lot of peat moss, compost, things of that nature, you make that light soil around there really rich and nutritious for that plant. But what happens in that heavy clay soil when you get the first heavy rain? Rain goes to the place where there's air pockets in that soil. So it's going to fill up that hole, that light backfill, that compost that you put in there. And now your plant is going to be sitting in a bathtub full of water in the soil. So that's why we say don't add amendments. Also, we want to encourage these roots to grow out into that native soil. So if you make a good lush environment rich environment for those roots to grow right around that root ball, they might not grow as quickly or as readily out into that soil, native soil, as what they would if it was right up against the root ball. The only exception I have to this rule is, you know, I live in Seymour. My backyard is very, very sandy. I might put a little bit of compost or peat moss in that backfill just to actually hold some moisture around that root ball, because very, very sandy soils tend to dry out very quickly and they don't have, you know, that water holding capacity. So again, what comes out of the hole needs to go back in the hole. Okay, that is planting. Anybody have any questions on planting? You can unmute yourself and ask at this moment if you want to, or.
Richard, I don't know, can you look at your chat?
Okay.
Cheryl had a couple of questions there.
Okay. Cheryl, can you give me a little bit more information about what you're talking about planting restrictions? What, you know?
I don't have a small lot. I have 10 acres almost.
Okay, okay.
About half of it is already covered in Mother Nature trees.
Okay, excellent.
We did plant several years ago, and I'm talking maybe 35 or 40 years ago, what the Extension Service guy that came out told us would be a good idea. The black walnuts are now spread all over the place.
Okay.
Despite only having one of them survive from our original planting. White pines are beginning to die.
Okay.
And I'm going to need to put something to replace the ones that are going out. That's a big, long discussion, but
are you looking for an evergreen replacement of that pine?
In some places, yes, because we have white pine, red pine, and some, I believe they're Virginia pine.
Okay.
And in some places, we want to screen from the road. In some places, we want to protect from a farm field and screen some lighting, things like that. We also have a lot of area that's an old farm field that we want to kind of fill in. And I'm wondering if we should get some variety of other things in here. I have a couple of big old oaks, especially over near the barn.
There's different philosophies on that. Some people like not quite a monoculture, but want to stick with maybe some native hardwoods or things like that. Other people try to get as much variety out there as you want. I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, whatever you happen to like. I'm not a big fan of planting only one species because you're in trouble if something happens. You know, like ash, if the emerald ash borer comes in and you only have ash trees, guess what? You end up with nothing. So, you know, a variety is probably the best option in my opinion, but, you know, a replacement for some of the white pines, and white pines do have a tendency after that 25 plus year to start dying out a little bit. Canadian hemlock is a good choice if you want an evergreen screening. It's pretty tolerant. It's a native plant. You know, it does quite well around here, things of that nature. So some of your other questions was good understory shrubs. Those are hard to come by. You know, some of the hydrangeas do fairly well. Oak leaf does fairly well, hydrangea. Some of the other shrubs like taxus and hollies and boxwoods and some of those, they need some sunlight. And that's the other thing that we talked about earlier, that making sure that it fits with what the conditions you have. So, okay.
I have 2 more questions if we have time for them in that regard. I don't know if you saw topping of trees.
Okay, we'll cover that when we get to pruning.
Okay, and the area that I'm wondering about the understory shrubs is along the roadside. We had 2 rows of very tall pine trees that were planted, like I said, maybe 45 years ago. And the highway department said that we could no longer have that. I convinced them that we could keep 1 row. It just tears me up when they do, like you had on your drawing, where they just cut them up and split them out. But my question is, when they took the front row out, the back row has almost no limbs on that side because they were together.
They were growing together.
And we have 2 or 3 more rows coming up behind them. I can't top the ones that are already there, I'm sure, but the ones that are planted behind them, some of them are about 5 feet maybe tall. If I top them at some point so they don't get into the trees, into the wires, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Are these the pines also, Cheryl?
They would be, yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm just not a fan of topping trees. You know, my theory is with that is they're never going to do what you want them to do when you cut that central leader, cut the top out of them, especially evergreens. They tend to get a little wide, but they tend to also not last very long and not full like they should be. My theory always is if you've got something that's overhead of, whether it's light wires, trees, other building structures, whatever, making sure that you just get something that fits in that space, because you will be constantly trying to keep those plants to the size, because some of those pines will even set new central leaders and start growing up, and it's just a vicious circle of pruning trees that much will get to, it just causes more issues down the road. So I would recommend you really looking at the site and trying to find something that fits that environment, that you don't have to worry about. Smaller ornamental trees, smaller shade trees, even some smaller evergreens that might fit in those areas.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on here, we're going to start talking a little bit about watering. You know, newly planted trees and shrubs, you know, inch of water a week, and that's either provided by you or provided by Mother Nature. I want that put down slow, so you're wetting that top 8+ inches of soil. That you want that water to go where you want those roots to grow. Roots grow in the best environment. So wherever that water is, that moist soil is, that's where the root's going to be. If you water quickly with a garden hose and a trigger sprayer, you might put it on an inch of water, but it's going to run off and it's only going to moisten the top 3 to 4 inches of soil. That's where the roots are going to grow. So if you have a water stress problem, or you're on vacation, or you leave for a couple weeks and you don't get to water every week, you can actually see some stress, moisture stress on those plants, just because those roots are up in that top layer of soil. So using some type of trickle irrigation, just laying a garden hose out there with a small trickle coming out of it and letting that water go on slowly. Recommend watering that for at least the first year. I see transplant shock stress problems with plants for 2 or 3 years out from when it was planted. So it takes a while, especially if it's a larger tree or shrub, for those roots to get established to support that plant. So keep watering. Other side of that is keep watering even in the winter, especially for evergreens. Those evergreens, those pines, the hollies, the boxwoods, those plants lose moisture all winter long. So we want to make sure there's plenty of moisture in that soil, even during the hottest, driest part, even the coldest part of the winter, we want water on those roots. So water is very, very important. The question is watering during frozen weather. You know, if the soil's frozen, you're not going to be able to water at that moment, but you know, typically the soil's not frozen all winter long. So when we have that little thaw, making sure that if there hasn't been snow cover that's melting, making sure those plants are watered, especially, you know, in that October, November, December timeframe going into winter. We don't want those plants to be stressed from lack of water, you know, going into winter. So good question though. Okay. One of my pet peeves on landscape plants is mulching. You know, a lot of people and even a lot of commercial landscape companies think they have to make the big piles, the big volcano piles of mulch. That's not ideal for the tree. That top picture there on the screen is not what we want to see. We want, again, like the picture showed earlier, the diagram, 3 to 4 inches of mulch in that root zone area, bring it up to the trunk and then taper it off to that trunk, to that root flare. Mulch, tree bark is meant to be by nature out in the air. It protects the tree trunk from environmental problems and aspects of the air. So if you put mulch up against it, it keeps it moist. It is ideal places for disease and water and disease and insects to get into the plant. The other problem with volcano piles of mulch, if you see the bottom part picture, that is a tree that's been there for probably close to 20 years. The first 10 years, they volcano piled mulch. But you see all these encircling roots, girdling roots that grew in that mulch pile. You know, and now as that tree is growing, these roots can actually girdle this tree and actually kill the tree. And most of those are growing because they had the volcano piles of mulch on them. So mulch is good. It keeps weeds down. It keeps moisture into that root zone. It keeps people like me with weed string trimmers away from trunks. So mulch is good, but again, 3 to 4 inches of mulch on top of the root zone, tapered off to nothing up next to the trunk. So, you know, avoid the volcano piles of mulch. Get some questions on tree fertilization or shrub fertilization. You know, we want our plants to be healthy. So we want to make sure they're not being limited in their growth by some nutrient. You know, as a general rule, 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot will be excellent. You can put part of that on early spring, just as the plants are breaking bud and coming out, putting the other half on mid-fall after leaf drop. Most of the time, if that tree is sitting in the middle of a turf lawn and you are fertilizing that lawn 1 or 2 times a year, I probably feel that that tree is getting more than enough nutrients from that lawn fertilization. If it's in a mulched bed, foundation planting, or a mulched bed out in the yard, those are the ones that might need to have a little bit of extra fertilizer added to them throughout the year, twice a year. So, you know, always get the question of, you can get the tree spikes, the compressed fertilizer in the spike that you pound in, relatively expensive for the pounds of nitrogen you're buying. You know, one of the better ways is just using a root auger or a bulb auger, drill some holes in a grid pattern around the tree, around the whole drip line, and just putting a little bit of fertilizer, dry granular fertilizer in those holes will work just as well and be a whole lot cheaper, easier on your pocketbook than the compressed spikes that you can buy. We want to avoid summer fertilizer because that tends to just promote late summer, early fall growth. And a lot of time that growth is not hardened off enough as we go into winter. Any questions on fertilizer? I see one. How deep should those holes be? If you can get that fertilizer down 10 inches or so in the soil, it will just help it move down through that, you know, root zone. Research has shown us that something like 75% of all tree roots are in the top 18 inches of soil. So we don't need to get it down real deep, but if we can get it down 6 to 10 inches in those holes, it will work. If you just want to broadcast it on the surface, it will work its way down through that soil also. So whichever way you want to do it. Any other questions on fertilizing, watering?
Yes, Richard, I did have
Yes.
on the evergreens. In spring, what are we considering bud swell? And in the fall, should it be the first year after they're planted or the second year after they're planted?
I avoid all granular fertilizer for that first year. Just, you know, if you want to give it a couple doses of water soluble that first year, like Peter's, Miracle Grow, Rapid Grow, sometimes that granular can be pretty hot on new roots. But if you plant it in the spring, I would not have a problem fertilizing it that first fall, but I would not fertilize it, you know, for the first 6 months or so. Bud swell in the spring is, you know, basically when it starts leafing out, you know, whatever that plant. We want to do it right at or before that bud swell. So it's the nutrients are there as that plant's really waking up and it really starts taking up nutrients and moisture out of the soil to feed those new leaves. Evergreens, just kind of gauge it by the rest of the plantings. When the deciduous plants are dropping leaves, that's when those evergreens can be fertilized also.
Thank you.
Okay, switching gears a little bit about pruning. Pruning is something that, you know, most of us tend to wait too long for, and becomes a much larger job and doesn't work as well. Most of the time with pruning, if we do a little bit routinely, the job is not too bad and we can handle it, and the plants handle it a lot better. Plants handle pruning if you're just trimming a small amount off of them instead of cutting 2/3 of the growth back or so. The first question is always, when is the proper time to prune? First off, 99% of the time, you're not going to kill a plant by pruning it at the wrong time. The worst case scenario usually is you might be cutting off the flower buds, so you miss some of that flower show on that plant. But things that bloom in the spring, plants that bloom before June 30th, they need to be pruned immediately after they bloom. They are blooming on old wood. So something like this star magnolia, it blooms early spring. Then it works all summer long, putting new flower buds on that are put on in the fall, set in the fall. Those flower buds overwinter on that old wood and then bloom next spring. So you want to prune those again immediately after the petal fall of the flower show in the spring. Ones that bloom during the summer, the things that are out in your yard that's blooming now, some of the hydrangeas, some of those type of plants, Rose of Sharon, things of that nature. We need to prune them while they're dormant, late winter, early spring, because they're going to bloom on new wood. So we want to encourage a lot of new wood, new growth during the year. So we prune them while they're dormant. They break bud, they send out a lot of growth in the spring. They have a lot of new growth, new wood for those flowers to be on in the summer. Again, are you going to kill the plant if you prune it the wrong time? Sometimes that forsythia, you pruned it in the spring, right after it bloomed, it grew all year and it's just wild. And you need to cut it back a little bit. You can cut that forsythia back knowing that you're just cutting a few of the bloom branches off of it. So again, if they bloom in the spring, immediately after they bloom. If they bloom during the summer, while they're dormant. What are your tools of the trade? What are your weapons of mass destruction for pruning? I will say that we probably all are guilty, I myself, of overusing our pruning tools. You know, they are designed for a certain job. The hand pruners there in the upper left, you need to have something, if it's the size of this pencil, that is what you need to be pruning with hand pruners. We all try real hard to get as much shoved in that pruner, or the loppers too, and see how big a branch we can cut off. All you're doing is springing those pruners, or loppers especially. We all probably have a pair of loppers that just doesn't cut real well. It cuts almost and leaves a piece of bark or thin piece of wood in that lopper. Guess what? At some point you tried to cut a too big a branch with those loppers and you sprung the blade in them. So hand pruners the size of a pencil, loppers about 3/4 of an inch is about as big. You know, anything bigger, you need to bring out the pruning saws, things of that nature. So, you know, use them, keep them well. My advice is always buy the best pair of pruners that you can afford. Take care of them, keep them clean, oil them well, and don't overuse them, and they will last you a lifetime. You know, I have a pair of pruners that I'm pretty much the only person who's going to use those pruners. I don't loan them out because they're a good pair and I want to keep them a good pair. But we overuse our pruners and loppers by a long shot. On the bottom left is a pair of hedge clippers. Those should only be used on formal hedges, square, you know, flat side hedges, things of that nature. If you are doing hedges, making sure that they are on the wide side at the bottom, narrow up to the top. That way they get all sunshine on all of it. If you cut them straight up and down most of the time, over the years, they'll become flying hedges where they die out of the bottom because they don't get sunshine on them. And someone posted something in the chat that says, I love my Friskers. You know, there's several name brands out there that are excellent, but buy good ones. And also a comment that ratchet loppers help. It does. You can take several tries at getting there, and it helps you get through a little bit larger branch. But okay, pruning young versus pruning mature trees. When you plant that tree, I always say just put it in the ground, let it go for a year, and see what the branch structure is. Come back that second year through the fifth year, those first 3 or 4 or 5 years there, and that's when you need to start looking at what does that branch scaffold look like. You know, because need to remember that where that branch is on that trunk, it's never going to move. As the tree grows, that branch doesn't grow up the tree. The growing point of the trees are at the end of the branches at the top of the central leader. So making sure that that branch system is established early on. When it's that second year, you can come in and cut some pretty good sized branches off and encourage new ones to grow the shape you want it. You know, one of the worst things that you can do is allow 2 main central leaders start growing on a shade tree. All that does is create a multi-stem tree that's going to have trouble. As that tree grows bigger, it has a tendency to fall apart. We want to make sure we encourage as wide a branch angle, as close to 90 degrees, as close to square attachment as possible. We'll talk a little bit about making clean cuts here in a couple slides. The other thing is no wound dressing. If you make a good clean pruning cut, that tree will encapsulate that wound, that damage, and it will continue to grow without any problems. So no paint, no wound sealer, no filling in holes of concrete, anything like that. Make a good clean cut and walk away. But we want to do most of our pruning on young plants. When they get up to be mature, you know, you only need to be doing pruning on them of what's really necessary. Is there a limb that died? Did something get damaged in a windstorm? Is there a disease or insect problem that you need to remove? Is it a threat to property or life? You know, having a hazard tree there is not what we want. So on mature trees, there's usually not a lot of pruning. The last item there is just don't top trees. It's not good for them. You know, I ask people why they do it, and the answer is, well, the tree guy came in and said I needed to have it done. The neighbors had it done. Mom and dad always had it done. You know, it doesn't need to be done. Trees out in the forest aren't topped, and they grow very long lives. So don't top them. If you top a tree, all you're doing is encouraging a lot of new growth, quick growth. Quick growth tends to be weak growth. It has poor attachment because it's coming out of side buds. Just don't top trees. End of story. It's just not a good thing. And I can get to you several different publications that talk about tree topping and things of that nature if that's of interest to you. You know, there's several different types of pruning cuts that are used in pruning trees and shrubs. A thinning cut, that's like taking the branch all the way back to the trunk. You're removing a whole branch, so you're thinning out that canopy. This tends to be one of the better cuts if you're doing some major pruning, a heading back cut is where you just come back and cut the end of the branch off. So you're cutting the length of it back, but what you're doing is you're going to encourage that end bud to break, and where you cut one off, you're going to have 3 or 4 branches come out. So if you're trying to thicken up a shrub, things of that nature, heading back works very well. On smaller plants, pinching tends to just be on deciduous plants, but it's just another pruning technique where, you know, something like garden mums that you come in during the summer, spring, and keep cutting back. You keep pinching back to get a more bushy, shrubbier type plant. You know, how do you make that cut? On the left there, you see a good technique of, you always want to make a cut at a bud where there's a bud that can break and come out and make a new branch. You know, compare the one on the left to the ones on the right. You're leaving too much stub. That stub, if you leave a stub on that branch before the bud, above the bud, it tends to die back down to the bud. So you can see the differences there, but you want to make that cut just immediately above the bud on that branch. If you are cutting a larger branch, we've all probably made that cut, and then what happens as that branch falls, it rips the bark down that tree and causes a big wound. We want to make cuts that, pruning cuts that do as little damage to the trunk and the bark, so that that tree can start growing and encapsulate that wound. So on a triple cut, you need to go out the branch a little ways and make a first cut from the underside of the branch. You want to stop a fraction of a second before that saw blade gets caught wedged in that tree, that branch. Take your saw, put it on top of the branch, and go out the branch a little bit and cut down through the branch. So the major amount of branch will fall off. As it falls and rips, that rip stops at that first cut. So you're not ripping back in the bark on the tree trunk. Come in and make the third and final cut right outside of that branch collar is where we look for. You can see the pictures on the right there. You know, again, too long a stub, that stub's going to die back and leave a hole, and start rotting back into the trunk. The far right, you've cut into that swollen area or that branch collar. So we want to avoid that because you're making a much larger wound. You know, the correct cut there in the middle, you're cutting that branch off right outside of that branch collar. That branch swollen area is ideally what we want to look for. Just a tree sample there of where the major cuts or what you might prune out. Looking down through some tips. Number one, as you go up the trunk there, don't leave stubs, cut back to that branch collar. 2, look up in that canopy and get rid of branches that are rubbing together. That's just a place to be wounded, and insects and diseases might get into that tree. So anything that's crossing or rubbing, need to remove one of those branches. Water sprouts are those sprouts that come up in the middle of the tree and just grow 5-10 times faster than everything else. Just remove those back at the trunk. It's just a natural phenomenon that they do. Look for suckers, anything coming up from the base. A lot of times if that's a grafted tree, those suckers are coming up from the root stock and will not be true to the type of plant that you're looking for. Anything that's closely together, get rid of, things of that nature. And again, look at the crotch angle, how that angle of that branch is attached to the trunk. we want that to be as wide as possible. If anybody is familiar with Bradford or Calorie pears, aristocrat pears that, you know, get up to 15+ years old and half the tree falls off into your front yard during the storm, that's all because of those really close, narrow crotch angles on those branches. So, you know, selectively prune for those wide angles. Some things on trimming shrubs. A lot of our shrubs take multiple prunings. I've got some boxwoods in my house that I prune twice a year just because they just keep growing and growing. Large overgrown ones like this forsythia or something like a lilac that has multiple stems that maybe it's just gotten too big for the spot, we can do multiple year prunings on those, coming in the first year and taking out 1/3 of the old growth all the way down to the ground. It will start producing new stems, new twigs. Next year, take out another 1/3 or half of the remaining old growth. And the 3rd year, finally remove the last, and you've rejuvenated that shrub, never made it look really bad, never cut it back hard. It's just, you know, kind of renewing it, and renewed shrubs tend to bloom better. They, you know, do better, resist diseases, insects, and that type of thing. We want to just avoid that sheared shrub look. We want to try to keep them as natural as possible. Evergreens are a little bit different. You know, the pine, spruces, firs will put out, as that picture shows, candle growth, that growth that comes out in that spring. And you can come in at that time and either pinch or cut out up to 2/3 of that candle growth, and that's what makes those, what makes a Christmas tree so dense with lots of branches in it, is because those that candle growth has been sheared off every year, and it produces a nice dense plant. Never cut that central leader. It's just, you know, especially on pines and spruces and evergreens, they're very central leader organized on that plant. You cut it, it tends to send out side shoots, and it will never have that shape that you want. One important thing with evergreens is do not prune back past the needles or the leaves into bare wood. Evergreens do not have the ability to break side buds and send out new shoots. You cut a maple branch back, it's going to break side buds, dormant buds, and send out new shoots. You cut a pine tree back into the tree past the needles, that branch is going to die back to the trunk. 2 evergreens that you can get by with pruning them back hard past the green growth: taxus, which is yews, and boxwoods. 95–99% of times will come back out of that hard prune, but just keep that in mind. You know, topping, you know, bad haircut pruning, we just want to avoid. You know, you end up with what I refer to as the flying hedge. You get growth up at the top and all these spindly legs. It just doesn't look well. So that's what we want to avoid, the haircut version. So going down and doing some pruning out of some of those branches of on that diagram there, you'll avoid this haircut pruning job. So again, just avoid the topping of trees. You know, if the pruning job is too big, call in a certified arborist. And I'm not saying call in a guy with a chainsaw, pickup, and a sign on his truck. I would advise you to look up Indiana Arborist Association, find someone who's a certified arborist, who's been through training, who's passed an exam and become certified. They can come in and give you advice on what you can do with especially an older mature tree, is it a hazard tree that needs to be removed, or can something be done to help? So, you know, keep that in mind, that there are people out there that can help. There is a charge for that service, but they are available for larger pruning jobs. Okay, sometimes you just got to know when to quit. And I think I'm about at that point. These are shrubs that probably would be best to just remove instead of trying to get back into shape. With that, I'm going to ask, is there any questions at this time? Let me stop sharing my screen and look at the chats here.
Yeah, you can probably see it. Cheryl's got some other questions there.
Okay. Any special tips for pruning red buds? Red buds are ones that can be pruned fairly hard. You know, again, you want to prune them immediately after they bloom so they will produce blooms next year, but they're the type of growth that you can do a little bit of pruning on them. Most of them are fairly slow growing, so unless there's a problem with a branch, or they do tend to get a lot of water sprouts in them also, so those need to be removed. Walnuts, you just want to make sure you don't cut that central leader out of them. Deer damage, good luck.
Well, that actually, one of my walnuts got the top cut out of it, the leaf was broken out by the deer.
And something like a walnut, if you get the central leader taken out of it, you can train another one to go up and kind of do a little bit of training,
like the evergreens.
Like the evergreens. And you know, it might be that you have to kind of tie one of the branches up to a stick and get the going, you know, staking it up so it gives it that central leader ability. But they can be, you know, done. You can train a new central leader on a walnut. Not an easy occupation, but it can be done. But how to avoid that deer damage, that's a tough one. You know, there are certain varieties of plants. We have a publication that talks about which ones might be a little more resistant to deer damage, but it is a tough one. So
call in the hunters.
Call in the hunters. Yeah, that's called deer population management.
And
okay.
Richard, I was just going to say, not, you know, promoting any particular products or anything, but I came upon one, I think it was called Deer Stop. I forget what the active ingredient was, but it smelled like rotten eggs or something. But I've sprayed that on.
A lot of times that's the active ingredient.
Yeah. And that has worked on a lot of our daylilies, some shrubs that, you know, they like to eat the blooms off of them when they're coming out, that kind of thing. So that has worked. And
I've heard good response for Irish Spring soap and human hair. But a lot of these have to be replaced after each rain event or over time, things of that nature.
I think I've tried all of those, mothballs too. Nothing seems to be getting rid of them, especially when the bucks are out there scraping.
Yep. Does anybody else have any questions over what we did not get covered that you came in with wanting an answer to?
And if you want to put it in the chat, we can see it, or if you want to unmute your microphone and you can just ask it. I'll say, Richard, while folks are thinking about that and which way they'll ask the question, Cheryl had also said when will, or how soon, you know, will this be recording released? The way I'm recording it, it's going to what we call the cloud. And this is, Kyle Weaver is in Switzerland County. It's his account. So it's however soon that Kyle, between working the fairs in 2 counties, he can get that. Or Richard has saved it or is going to save it to his computer. Richard, whether you'll say you'll post it on yours or you'll send it to Kyle as well.
Yeah, we don't know. We'll let you all know. And you will probably get an email from us that lists all of the recordings for this series, is what probably I think what Kyle had planned on doing. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? And like, if you come up with something, you can contact either Tom or myself, and we'll be glad to get those answered for you. If you, on the way, tomorrow morning you thought, oh, should I ask that question, just get a hold of one of us and we can, get that answered for you. Let me.
Yes, I was just going to say Richard's in the Jackson County office. I'm in the Clark County office. Cheryl, you're in Switzerland County, I believe.
I just put my email address in the chat box if you want to make note of that. If you have some questions, feel free to drop them to me.
Yeah, there you go.
So who would be in, I'm in Ripley County, so who would be Dearborn?
Dave Osborne is in your county.
Dave Osborne. Okay.
You can contact any of us. We don't stop things at county lines.
Right. It's just a matter of how busy you are. I think in the Ripley County Fair going on.
Yes, Ripley County Fair is getting ready to go because I'm going to go there Friday to judge. So.
I might just, Richard was maybe going to mention this, but this being the second evening of our 5-part series, next week, Wednesday, the 22nd, this same time of 5 o'clock, myself and co-workers Robert Waller's in Jennings County and Simon Kafari's in Clark County, the three of us are going to be presenting the topic of Reap What You Sow, which is a practical guide to successful gardening. The week after that, on the 29th, Kyle Weaver is going to be discussing farm finances and succession planning. And then on Wednesday, the August 5th, Jeff Hermish is going to talk about fall lawn care tips. And then to conclude the series on Wednesday, the 12th, Dave Osborne, who's there in Ripley County, is going to be working with Aquatic Control out of Seymour to present a program on pond management. So if y'all hadn't signed up for those, I think from the way that you had went in and done the Qualtrics survey is how you can go in and sign up again, or sign up for those others, or just click on to this link that we had at the little before 5 o'clock hour and should be able to get right in.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, we appreciate you all taking time out of your all's busy schedule to, and you'll probably be getting a survey, I think, to ask about input on future programs and what your ideas will be. With that, good evening and stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
And did a good job, Richard. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Richard.